There is a moment that happens quietly, usually in a group. Laughter moves around the room without effort. Stories overlap. Someone finishes a sentence and another begins before the silence can settle. The energy feels fluid, practiced, as though everyone knows when to step in and when to yield. You are there, not pushed out, not ignored, just slightly outside the current. You listen. You track the movement of conversation. You notice how often the same ideas surface with different phrasing, how opinions form quickly, gather agreement, then dissolve once the energy shifts elsewhere. Nothing about it feels hostile. Nothing feels wrong. It just does not pull you in. People might assume you are shy, or reserved, or uninterested. That explanation almost works, but not quite. You are not uncomfortable. You are not withdrawn. You are present and aware. You are simply not compelled. You begin to notice how much social closeness relies on rhythm, on timing responses just right, on offering reactions that keep the momentum moving. There is a pace to it, a subtle agreement about when to speak, how long to stay engaged, how much emotional weight to offer in return. You participate at first, you respond, you contribute. You match the rhythm well enough to blend in. Then something slows. It is not boredom, it is not judgment. It feels more like internal friction. You begin to register the cost, not the people themselves, but the maintenance, the constant calibration, the emotional tracking required to remain lightly connected to many individuals at once, the unspoken expectations that accumulate quietly, the sense that small interactions demand more internal attention than they appear to require. You notice how often casual messages carry hidden weight, how frequently check-ins are not neutral, but directional, how shared routines begin to form expectations without being discussed. Others do not seem to notice this. They move easily between conversations. They maintain wide circles without visible effort. They enjoy the flow. They gain energy from the exchange. You do not envy them. You simply do not move the same way. Over time, you become aware of your own internal economy, how much attention you have available, how much emotional bandwidth feels sustainable, how quickly overstimulation turns into noise rather than connection. You begin filtering without announcing it. You respond less often. You linger less. You allow some connections to loosen naturally. There is no conflict. There is no rupture. Just a gradual narrowing. From the outside, it might look like withdrawal. Inside, it feels like coherence. You are aware of the change, but you do not advertise it. You do not frame it as a decision. It feels more like a quiet adjustment to something you have always sensed. Fewer connections feel cleaner. Not emptier, not lonelier, cleaner. With less social density, your internal world becomes more legible. You notice how certain friendships subtly demand emotional labor, how humor sometimes masks tension, how closeness can exist without honesty. You do not judge this, you simply register it. And once you register it, pretending becomes difficult. You have always been like this, even earlier in life. You remember being selective long before you had language for it. Not exclusive, not guarded, intentional. You sensed when someone wanted proximity without depth, when connection was based on convenience rather than resonance, when time together created more stimulation than meaning. So you drifted, not dramatically, quietly. People did not always notice. They just stopped hearing from you as often. Messages spaced out. Invitations went unanswered without explanation. You did not cut ties. You loosened them. That choice shaped your life slowly. Fewer friends, more space, less noise, more clarity. People often equate social ease with intelligence, the ability to network, to charm, to maintain many relationships at once. By that measure, you might seem limited, but something inside you does not feel limited. Your inner world feels unusually active. You think deeply about interactions long after they end. You replay subtle moments others forget. You reflect on tone, timing, and subtext without effort. You notice patterns in people's behavior quickly. You often sense when relationships will last and when they will not. This awareness does not make you superior. It makes you careful. And careful people often end up with fewer connections, not because they cannot form them, but because they do not form them lightly. You also notice how solitude affects you differently. It does not hollow you out. It sharpens you. You feel more oriented when you are alone, more present, more aligned. Being alone does not drain you. Too much social noise does. This difference becomes more pronounced over time. You begin to realize that what others experience as ease, you experience as cost. What feels light to them requires internal adjustment from you. What feels casual to them asks for sustained attention from you. This is where it shifts. You stop trying to move the way others move, not as a rejection, as an acknowledgement. You acknowledge that your system is built differently. You are not missing something, you are filtering something. And filtering changes everything. Over time, you begin to notice how early these adjustments started. Not as memories with clear edges, but as impressions. Moments where you sensed you were slightly out of sync long before anyone said so. In classrooms, at lunch tables, during group projects where roles formed quickly and you hovered just outside of them. You were not rejected outright. You were not excluded deliberately. You were simply not chosen first. Others seemed to bond effortlessly, trading humor, building familiarity through repetition. You watched how quickly alliances formed around shared interests, shared complaints, shared energy. You participated when invited. You contributed when needed. But something about the dynamic felt provisional. You noticed how attention shifted, how enthusiasm had a rhythm, how belonging seemed to require a certain emotional frequency you did not naturally sustain. You learned early to observe before entering. This observation was not defensive. It was adaptive. You began tracking which spaces felt draining and which felt neutral, which interactions required performance, and which allowed you to remain internally aligned. You learned, without being taught, that staying slightly outside cost less than forcing yourself in. So you adjusted. You became quieter, not because you had nothing to say, but because you were listening more than speaking. You learned to read the room before deciding where to place your energy. You learned to sense when engagement would be reciprocal and when it would become maintenance. This skill developed quietly. You did not announce it as maturity or insight. It simply became how you moved. Over time, this created a subtle distance between you and others. Not emotional distance, structural distance. You were present, but not enmeshed. Involved, but not absorbed. From the outside, this sometimes looked like detachment. Inside, it felt like regulation. You were learning how to preserve internal coherence. You noticed how quickly group dynamics could turn chaotic, how opinions hardened when challenged, how humor sometimes masked competition, how closeness could carry unspoken demands. You did not feel drawn to that, not because you judged it, because you felt the cost. You felt it in your body as tension, in your attention as fatigue, in your mood as a dulling of clarity. So you filtered. Filtering did not mean avoidance, it meant selection. You selected conversations that allowed depth. You selected people who could tolerate silence. You selected environments that did not require constant calibration. As a result, your social world became smaller. Not suddenly, gradually. You began to notice how others interpreted this. Some assumed you were aloof. Some assumed you were sensitive. Some assumed you were uninterested. None of those explanations fit cleanly. You were interested. You were engaged. You were simply selective. Selectivity is often misunderstood in social environments that value openness without boundaries. You noticed how quickly people equated availability with warmth, how being reachable at all times became a measure of care, how constant contact was mistaken for closeness. You did not operate that way. You needed space between interactions. You needed time to integrate what you felt. You needed room to return to yourself. This need was not negotiable. You tried negotiating it anyway. There were periods when you pushed yourself to maintain more connections than felt sustainable. You responded quickly. You stayed longer. You said yes when your internal signal said no. You felt the consequence almost immediately. Your thoughts scattered. Your body felt tight. Your emotional clarity dulled. You realized something important. Your system could not process social input at the same volume as others, not because it was weaker, but because it was deeper. You processed nuance. You absorbed subtext. You tracked emotional undercurrents automatically. What others skimmed, you registered. That registration required space. Without space, it became overload. So you stopped overriding yourself. This decision was quiet. There was no declaration, no turning point others could see. You simply began honoring your internal signals. You left gatherings earlier. You responded when you had capacity. You let connections fade when they required too much maintenance without meaning. This was not isolation. It was containment. Containment allowed you to remain clear instead of scattered. It allowed you to feel without being flooded. It allowed you to stay connected to yourself. You began to notice how different this felt from loneliness. Loneliness felt hollow. This felt intentional. There was a difference between being alone because no one was there and being alone because you had chosen coherence over noise. You felt the difference immediately. With fewer social demands, your attention deepened, your thoughts slowed, your emotional responses became more precise. You were not numbing yourself. You were filtering input. This filtering shaped your behavior in subtle ways. You became slower to commit socially. You asked fewer but more intentional questions. You stopped filling silence to ease discomfort. Silence did not unsettle you. It informed you. You noticed who could sit in it. You noticed who rushed to fill it. You noticed who grew anxious without constant feedback. These observations guided you. You did not withdraw from people. You withdrew from dynamics that required you to abandon internal alignment. This distinction became clearer as you grew older. You stopped measuring connection by frequency. You stopped equating presence with proximity. You stopped assuming that more meant better. Instead, you measured coherence. How you felt after an interaction, whether you felt expanded or contracted, whether clarity remained or dissolved. This internal measurement replaced external expectations. It changed everything. Over time, these adjustments begin to solidify, not as conscious strategies, but as ways of moving that feel increasingly natural. You begin to notice how quickly you assess social environments now, how little time it takes for you to sense whether a space will require performance or allow authenticity. You register the emotional temperature almost immediately. You notice who dominates conversations and who disappears inside them. You notice which groups rely on constant stimulation and which allow pauses. You notice when connection is built on shared presence versus shared distraction. This noticing happens without effort. It feels less like analysis and more like orientation. You orient toward environments that feel coherent, away from those that feel noisy. This orientation is quiet but consistent. As a result, you become harder to place socially. You are not the center of the group. You are not on the margins either. You exist slightly to the side. That position gives you perspective. From there, you see how often social belonging is maintained through subtle compromises, how frequently people adjust their tone, interests, or boundaries to remain included, how often connection is preserved by smoothing over discomfort rather than addressing it. You feel the pull to do the same, and you resist it, not forcefully, gently. You allow yourself to be misunderstood rather than misaligned. This choice carries consequences. Some connections weaken, some invitations stop coming, some people assume you are unavailable. You notice the loss, but you also notice the relief. With fewer social obligations, your internal space expands. You have more room to think, to feel, to integrate. You begin to recognize how much of your energy had been spent maintaining light connections that never deepened. You do not resent this. You simply adjust. This adjustment begins to show up in your behavior. You become slower to respond to messages that feel obligatory rather than meaningful. You decline plans that require excessive coordination without clear purpose. You choose quality over continuity. Others may interpret this as distance. Inside, it feels like alignment. You are no longer stretching yourself thin to meet unspoken expectations. You are no longer absorbing social friction to keep things smooth. You begin to trust your internal signals more than external cues. This trust changes how you listen. You listen for coherence rather than enthusiasm. You listen for depth rather than volume. You listen for sincerity rather than charisma. You begin to notice how often people confuse intensity with intimacy, how quickly emotional expression is taken as proof of connection, how rarely silence is allowed to carry meaning. You do not rush to fill silence. You let it work. Silence reveals things. It reveals who is comfortable without feedback. It reveals who relies on reaction to feel real. It reveals who can stay present without being entertained. These revelations guide you. You do not announce your criteria. You do not explain your withdrawal. You simply adjust your availability. This adjustment is often mistaken for emotional distance, but distance implies separation. What you are doing is preserving internal coherence. You are protecting your capacity to feel deeply without being overwhelmed. You are maintaining clarity in a world that often rewards noise. You notice how others seem energized by constant social contact, how they thrive on variety, stimulation, and exchange. You respect that. It is simply not how your system works. Your system processes more per interaction. You register nuance, others skim. You absorb emotional subtext without trying. This depth comes with cost. You have learned to manage that cost. Management becomes habit. You pace your interactions. You limit your exposure. You create buffers. These buffers are not walls. They are filters. Filters allow what nourishes to pass through and keep what depletes at bay. Over time, this filtering becomes automatic. You no longer second guess it. You trust that when something feels heavy without reason, there is information there. When an interaction leaves you scattered, it is telling you something. When solitude restores you, it confirms something about your nature. You stop apologizing internally for these needs. You stop framing them as shortcomings. Instead, you begin to see them as signals of intelligence, not intellectual intelligence, internal intelligence, an ability to sense limits before they are crossed, an ability to withdraw before resentment builds, an ability to choose coherence over conformity. This intelligence has always been present. It was shaped by being slightly pushed aside socially, by noticing early that belonging often came with conditions, by learning that staying true to yourself sometimes meant standing just outside the group. You did not harden because of this. You refined. You became more discerning, more selective, more intentional. This discernment affects how you relate now. You do not rush intimacy. You do not maintain connections out of habit. You do not confuse familiarity with closeness. You prefer fewer relationships that allow depth over many that require performance. This preference is not reactive. It is grounded. You feel it in how your body relaxes around the right people, in how conversation slows naturally, in how silence feels shared rather than awkward. These moments confirm what you have learned. You do not need many connections to feel connected. You need coherent ones. At some point, you realize these patterns are no longer situational. They have become internal defaults. You no longer decide whether to engage or withdraw in each moment. Your system makes those decisions for you efficiently, without drama. You sense what an interaction will require before it fully begins. You begin to notice how quickly your attention filters information now, how fast you distinguish between signal and noise, how little tolerance you have for interactions that feel diffuse or performative. This is not impatience, it is internal economy. You have learned, through repetition, what drains you and what sustains you. You have learned that your attention is not infinite, that your emotional bandwidth narrows under constant stimulation. That social abundance does not translate into internal abundance for you, so you conserve. You do not conserve out of fear. You conserve out of clarity. Clarity sharpens your perception of social dynamics. You notice how often people seek connection not for mutual understanding, but for regulation. They want their internal state stabilized through proximity. They want reassurance, affirmation, distraction. You understand this impulse. You simply do not volunteer yourself for it. You have learned that being someone else's regulator comes at a cost. It requires emotional availability without reciprocity. It requires attentiveness without rest. You no longer offer that by default. This decision reshapes how people experience you. Some feel you have changed. Some feel you have grown distant. Some feel you are harder to reach. You feel more intact. You begin to recognize how often social structures reward those who override themselves, those who remain available regardless of capacity, those who prioritize harmony over honesty. You are no longer willing to do that. Not as a statement, as a condition. You notice how often social cohesion depends on unspoken agreements to ignore discomfort. How frequently groups move forward by glossing over tension rather than addressing it. How rarely space is made for slowness. You do not move quickly anymore. You move deliberately. Deliberation allows you to stay oriented. It allows you to respond rather than react. It allows you to remain present without becoming fragmented. This deliberation is sometimes misread. People may interpret your pauses as hesitation, your silence as disengagement, your selectivity as judgment. You do not correct these interpretations. Correcting them would require you to justify your internal process. You do not feel compelled to do that. You have learned that explaining yourself rarely creates understanding. It often creates more expectations. So you allow misunderstanding to exist. This allowance is not indifference, it is prioritization. You prioritize coherence over consensus, alignment over approval, depth over breadth. This prioritization did not arise from isolation. It arose from being pushed aside socially in subtle ways. Not rejected, not excluded, but consistently peripheral. That position taught you something early. It taught you to self-orient. When others oriented through group feedback, you learned to orient internally. When others relied on social reinforcement to confirm their place, you learned to confirm yourself quietly. This internal orientation became a survival pattern, not a defensive one, a stabilizing one. You developed an ability to remain steady without constant external input, to feel grounded without social reinforcement, to maintain identity without mirroring. This ability serves you now. It allows you to step back from interactions that would erode clarity. It allows you to choose solitude without experiencing emptiness. It allows you to maintain relationships without overextending. You notice how solitude feels different now. It is not escape, it is restoration. In solitude, your thoughts organize themselves. Your emotional responses integrate. Your attention deepens. You feel more yourself. This experience reinforces your selectivity. You begin to understand that your need for space is not avoidance. It is maintenance. You maintain internal coherence by limiting external noise. Noise for you is not volume. It is misalignment. Misalignment occurs when you stay in interactions that require you to ignore your internal signals. When you remain socially engaged beyond your capacity. When you prioritize appearance of connection over felt connection, you no longer do that. You notice how this changes the quality of your relationships. Those that remain tend to be quieter, less performative, more grounded. There is less checking in, less maintenance, more mutual respect for space. You do not need constant reassurance to feel connected. Neither do they. This mutual understanding feels rare. You recognize it immediately when it appears. It confirms something you have long suspected. Your system was never built for social abundance. It was built for depth. Depth requires fewer points of contact. It requires time. It requires space. It also requires the ability to tolerate being misunderstood. You have developed that ability. You no longer need to be seen by many. You no longer need to be included everywhere. You no longer need to explain your absence. You know why you move the way you do. This knowledge is quiet. It does not seek validation. It simply shapes your life. Eventually, you stop relating to these patterns as something you need to justify. You no longer ask whether you should be more social, more available, more open. You no longer measure yourself against rhythms that were never natural to you. You understand now that what once looked like social sidelining shaped an internal intelligence. An intelligence that learned early how to conserve energy, how to filter stimulation, how to remain coherent without constant feedback. You recognize how this intelligence expresses itself in the way you pause before responding, in the way you notice emotional shifts without reacting to them, in the way you choose fewer connections and feel more whole because of it. You no longer experience this as loss. You experience it as orientation. Orientation toward what sustains you, orientation away from what fragments you. You see how easily people confuse visibility with value, how often social presence is mistaken for depth, how frequently connection is measured by frequency rather than substance. You do not operate by those measures. You operate by internal clarity. Clarity is quiet. It does not announce itself. It does not compete. It does not need to be reinforced. It simply informs your choices. You choose solitude without interpreting it as isolation. You choose selectivity without interpreting it as fear. You choose silence without interpreting it as absence. Silence, for you, has always been active. It is where you integrate what you feel. It is where impressions settle into understanding. It is where emotional residue clears. You notice how this integration affects you. You feel less reactive, less scattered, more precise. You do not rush to form opinions. You do not rush to form bonds. You allow time to reveal coherence or the lack of it. This patience is often misunderstood. Others may see hesitation. You experience discernment. Discernment does not seek efficiency. It seeks alignment. Alignment requires waiting. You have become comfortable with waiting, waiting to see how people behave over time, waiting to see whether connection deepens or dissipates, waiting to see whether engagement feels reciprocal or extractive. This waiting protects you, not from people, from misalignment. You have learned that misalignment is more draining than solitude. Solitude restores you because it allows your system to reset, to return to baseline, to regain clarity. You no longer question that. You also notice how this clarity affects your presence. When you do engage, you are fully there. You listen deeply. You notice nuance. You respond thoughtfully. You are not distracted by maintaining multiple social threads. You are not divided across many obligations. Your attention has weight. This weight is felt by the few who are close to you. They do not need constant contact to feel connected. Neither do you. There is space in the relationship, space for individuality, space for silence. This space does not weaken connection. It strengthens it. You have learned that closeness without space becomes pressure, that connection without boundaries becomes noise. You no longer tolerate noise, not because you are rigid, because you are clear. This clarity is not defensive, it is integrated. It holds your sensitivity and your boundaries together. It allows you to feel deeply without being overwhelmed. It allows you to care without dissolving. You are not less social than others. You are differently organized. Your system prioritizes coherence over quantity, depth over breadth, meaning over momentum. This organization is not something you develop by accident. It grew out of being pushed aside socially, quietly, repeatedly. Out of learning early that belonging often came with conditions. Out of recognizing that fitting in required a kind of self-abandonment you were unwilling to sustain. So you adapted. You adapted by turning inward rather than outward, by developing internal reference points instead of relying on group validation, by learning how to be with yourself without discomfort. This adaptation became strength, not the visible kind, the structural kind, the kind that allows you to move through the world without needing constant affirmation, the kind that allows you to step back without collapsing, the kind that allows you to choose solitude without feeling diminished. You no longer frame your life as smaller. It feels cleaner. There is less noise competing for your attention, less emotional residue left behind by casual interactions, less obligation masquerading as connection. There is more space. Space to think, space to feel, space to integrate. You live inside that space now, not as retreat, as clarity. As this clarity settles, you notice something subtle. You no longer feel the urge to re-enter social spaces simply to prove that you can. You no longer feel the need to counter assumptions about being quiet, selective, or distant. Those assumptions exist, but they no longer shape your behavior. You move according to internal coherence, not external interpretation. You recognize how often people equate social visibility with emotional health, how frequently wide circles are taken as evidence of fulfillment, how rarely anyone asks whether those connections are metabolized or merely maintained. You have asked yourself that question many times. You know what it feels like to maintain connection without meaning, to keep threads alive out of habit rather than resonance, to stay reachable even when your internal system is signaling overload. You no longer override those signals. You trust them. Trusting them has changed your relationship to time. You no longer rush social bonding. You no longer compress intimacy into schedules. You no longer confuse momentum with depth. Time reveals what belongs. You allow it to. You notice that the people who remain in your life tend to share a similar rhythm. Conversations do not require constant stimulation. Silence is not treated as a problem to solve. There is an understanding that space does not threaten connection. This understanding feels rare. You recognize it immediately when it appears. It confirms what your experience has been teaching you all along. You were never meant to maintain many shallow ties. You were meant to cultivate a few grounded ones. This realization does not come with relief or sadness. It comes with steadiness. You also notice how your early experiences of being socially peripheral shaped your independence. How learning to sit slightly outside group dynamics taught you how to orient internally. How observing rather than participating became a way of staying whole. You did not develop this orientation because you lacked social skill. You developed it because you perceived social cost early. You sensed the emotional labor hidden inside casual closeness. You noticed how often belonging required adjustment rather than authenticity. You learned that staying aligned sometimes meant standing apart. This learning never hardened you. It refined you. You remain open to connection. You remain sensitive to others. You remain capable of deep empathy. But you no longer offer yourself indiscriminately. You understand that empathy without boundaries leads to diffusion. That sensitivity without filtering leads to exhaustion. That openness without containment erodes clarity. You have learned containment. Containment allows you to feel without flooding, to listen without absorbing, to engage without disappearing. This containment is invisible from the outside. From the inside, it is structural. It holds your life together. You notice how this structure affects your emotional responses. You recover more quickly from social interaction. You carry less residue from conversations. You do not replay exchanges with regret or self-doubt as often. Your inner world feels quieter, not empty, ordered. Order does not mean rigidity, it means coherence. You can feel complex emotions without being overwhelmed by them. You can hold conflicting impressions without needing immediate resolution. You can allow uncertainty to exist without anxiety. This capacity was shaped slowly by early moments of not quite fitting, by repeated experiences of being adjacent rather than central, by learning to rely on your own perception when external validation was inconsistent. These experiences did not diminish you. They taught you how to self-orient. Self-orientation is not isolation. It is internal anchoring. You are anchored now. This anchoring allows you to move through social environments without losing yourself, to engage when it feels aligned, to step back when it does not, to remain calm in situations that would have once felt overwhelming. You no longer interpret stepping back as failure. You interpret it as accuracy. Accuracy about your limits. Accuracy about your needs. Accuracy about what kind of connection sustains you. You are not avoiding people. You are avoiding fragmentation. Fragmentation happens when you ignore internal signals to maintain external harmony. When you stay connected at the cost of coherence, when you substitute presence for performance, you no longer do that. This does not make your life smaller. It makes it quieter. And in that quiet, you notice more. You notice when something matters. You notice when it does not. You notice the difference between attention and attachment. You no longer chase attachment. You allow attention to settle where it belongs. This is the outcome of being pushed aside socially in subtle ways. Not alienation, clarity. A clarity that does not announce itself. A clarity that does not seek explanation. A clarity that simply continues to shape how you live. You live with fewer connections, but more integrity. Less noise, but more meaning, more space, and more coherence. You do not frame this as gain or loss. It is simply how your system organizes itself now, quietly. You no longer try to explain this organization to anyone. Explanation would reduce it to preference or personality, and it is neither. It is structural. It is how your system learned to survive without becoming rigid, how it learned to remain open without becoming scattered. You notice how rarely this kind of internal clarity is named. People talk easily about social confidence, popularity, belonging. They talk less about internal coherence, about what it takes to remain psychologically intact in environments that reward constant engagement. You have learned that intactness often requires restraint, not withdrawal, not avoidance, restraint. Restraint in where you place attention, restraint in how much you give, restraint in how often you allow yourself to be pulled outward. This restraint does not feel like deprivation, it feels like precision. Precision allows you to live closer to your actual experience rather than the version others expect. It allows you to respond to life instead of reacting to noise. It allows your sensitivity to remain a source of insight rather than exhaustion. You are aware that this way of living is often misunderstood. From the outside, fewer connections can look like isolation. Quiet can look like absence. Selectivity can look like lack. Inside, none of that is true. Inside, there is continuity. Your thoughts connect rather than scatter. Your emotions integrate rather than spill. Your attention rests rather than fragments. This continuity gives you a stable sense of self, not a loud one, not a performative one, a steady one. You carry it with you into every interaction. You do not leave it behind to gain acceptance. You do not dilute it to maintain belonging. Belonging that requires dilution no longer feels like belonging to you. You understand now that what once felt like being pushed aside socially was also an early invitation inward. An invitation to develop internal reference points rather than external ones. An invitation to learn discernment before conformity. You accepted that invitation without knowing it. You accepted it each time you stepped back rather than forced yourself forward. Each time you chose quiet over overstimulation. Each time you honored the feeling that something was costing you more than it was giving. Those choices accumulated. They shaped your nervous system. They shaped your relationships. They shaped your sense of what matters. You no longer confuse abundance with richness. Richness, for you, comes from coherence, from having enough space to notice your own experience, from having enough silence to hear what feels true. You move through the world with that understanding now. You do not rush to be included. You do not rush to be known. You do not rush to be understood. You let understanding emerge where it can. You are comfortable being peripheral when the center feels noisy. Comfortable stepping back when closeness becomes performative. Comfortable choosing fewer, quieter forms of connection. This comfort is not indifference. It is self-alignment. Alignment does not need validation. It does not need reinforcement. It does not need to be named. It simply continues shaping your life. You notice that when connection does arrive now, it arrives differently. Slower, more deliberate, less demanding. It does not ask you to be smaller or louder than you are. It meets you where you already stand. You recognize that feeling immediately. It feels like ease without stimulation, like closeness without pressure, like being understood without explanation. You do not chase it, you allow it. And when it does not appear, you remain at ease with yourself. This is not resignation. It is internal sufficiency. You have learned how to be with yourself without distraction, how to listen inwardly without anxiety, how to live with fewer external anchors because your internal ones are stable. This stability did not come from confidence. It came from clarity. Clarity earned through early social distance, through repeated observation, through learning the cost of misalignment and choosing coherence instead. You do not frame your life as solitary. It feels intentional. You do not frame your selectivity as loss. It feels intelligent. You do not frame your quiet as absence. It feels full. And you do not need to conclude this understanding. It continues unfolding each time you choose space over noise. Each time you listen to internal signals instead of external pressure. Each time you trust that fewer, clearer connections are enough. You live inside that trust now, quietly. You notice how this way of living changes your relationship to expectation. You no longer feel pressure to respond in ways that smooth over discomfort. You no longer feel obligated to participate in social rituals that feel empty once you are inside them. You recognize when something is being done out of habit rather than intention. Habit has its own gravity. It pulls people into motion without asking whether the motion still serves them. You have learned how to resist that pull, not through effort, but through awareness. Awareness interrupts automatic behavior. You pause where others continue. You slow where others accelerate. You step back where others lean in. These choices are not dramatic. They do not announce themselves. They simply happen because your internal signals are clear enough to be trusted. You are aware that clarity can look like distance from the outside. That restraint can be mistaken for indifference. That selectivity can be framed as lack. You no longer feel compelled to correct those impressions. Correcting them would require you to re-enter the very dynamics you have learned to step away from. It would require you to translate your internal logic into a language built for external approval. You do not need that translation. You know what your experience feels like from the inside. It feels ordered. It feels deliberate. It feels sustainable. Sustainability matters to you now more than intensity ever did. You have seen what happens when intensity drives connection, how quickly it burns through attention, how often it leaves residue behind, how much recovery it demands afterward. You choose a different pace, a pace that allows you to remain oriented, a pace that does not require recovery, a pace that leaves you intact after interaction rather than depleted. This pace is not slow for its own sake. It is accurate. Accuracy requires listening. Listening requires space. Space requires restraint. You have learned how to build that space into your life, not as isolation, but as structure. Structure that supports your sensitivity instead of overwhelming it. Structure that allows you to stay perceptive without becoming flooded. Structure that lets you care without carrying what is not yours. You notice how rarely this kind of structure is modeled. Many people are taught how to be social, but not how to be selective. How to engage, but not how to disengage. How to belong, but not how to remain whole while belonging. You learn those things indirectly, by being slightly outside, by watching patterns repeat, by noticing what felt misaligned before you had language for it. Those early experiences shaped you more than you realized at the time. They taught you how to observe without judgment, how to register cost without resentment, how to withdraw without rupture. They taught you that stepping back does not always mean stepping away. Sometimes it means stepping into clarity. You live from that clarity now. It informs how you choose relationships, how you spend time, how you manage energy, how you decide what deserves attention and what does not. You do not need many points of reference to feel anchored. You have learned how to anchor internally. That anchoring gives you a quiet confidence, not the kind that seeks recognition, the kind that remains steady without reinforcement. You carry it with you into solitude and into connection. It does not change depending on context. It does not need to be adjusted. It simply holds. And because it holds, you are no longer afraid of space. You do not rush to fill it. You do not mistake it for emptiness. You recognize space as capacity, capacity to notice, capacity to reflect, capacity to choose deliberately rather than automatically. You trust that capacity now. You trust that your way of moving through the world makes sense for you, even if it does not resemble the dominant patterns around you. You trust that fewer connections can still be meaningful, that quieter lives can still be full. You trust that internal clarity is not something to apologize for. You do not need to frame it as strength or weakness. It is simply how you are organized. And that organization continues shaping your life quietly. Each time you choose coherence over noise, discernment over momentum, and space over obligation.